guys, it's Julesy, and I'm trying a slightly different lighting setup. I don't know how this is gonna look, but it's what we're trying for now. But since I'm in the throes of doing reviews, I thought it would be fitting to do a review of Handmaid's Tale. We are in the middle of season 3. The show comes on Hulu. I was a general fan of season 1, and the series is based on Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel of the same title. There was a film that came out, I believe, in the late 80s, early 90s. The book itself came out in 1985. I generally have enjoyed every Wednesday during each season of sitting down and consuming an hour of white woman privilege and trauma. But I, as of episode 8, season 3, am spent. I am now offended and annoyed with the racial trajectory, or lack thereof, of the show. Now, since season 1, there has been a criticism of the show's handling of race, where a sect of evangelical Christianity has taken over the United States, or at least a big chunk of the United States, and overthrown American democracy as it is known, and recreated the states as a land called Gilead. And I haven't read the book, and I should. I've heard it's actually a really good book, but in the show, at least, there are themes that align itself with the way sort of Nazism was allowed to kind of rise in Germany, how sort of cultural shifts happen that allow extreme governments to come into play, and that happening in America through an evangelical Christian lens. And the precipice of this is that the birth rate in the States lowers, and a lot of women supposedly are sterile, though the show does hint at the idea that it's possibly men who are also incapable of impregnating their wives. But it becomes a thing where a majority of women are unable to naturally conceive. And in this reimagining of the society under the rule of Gilead, there are handmaids who are simply used to procreate, and there are a class of women who fall into the ruling class, who are somehow, the whole ruling class of women is infertile but follows the rule of Gilead, and everyone who is fertile becomes either a handmaid's tale, or they're allowed to live with a mate in a house. I forget what their title is. We saw one, I believe, in season 2, where we had an interracial couple with child who lived together. And then there are Marthas, who are barren women who take care of the household. Then there are aunts who rule over and keep the handmaids in check. And then there are Jezebels, who are being punished by having to essentially work in a brothel. The issue that I'm having, that has long been criticized with regards to race in the show, and was also criticized in the book, is the poor handling of how this sort of enslavement of what is largely white women mirrors a lot of how enslavement worked for Black people, and the peculiarity Black women were faced with, shout out to Dorothy E. Roberts and Killing the Black Body, with how we were both used during chattel slavery. It was both a form of trauma and abuse to sexually harm Black women, but that they were also used to create what was essentially at the time considered more cattle, right? That their offspring were not actually viewed as humans, but viewed as products. And this sort of double consciousness that Black women had to take on in both giving birth to children, that they were entering into a world of slavery, but also wanting to help that child survive, right? Because Black women are largely the reason that the African American community survived slavery. Because you imagine if Black women decided to en masse kill their children, and can you really fault a Black slave woman for murdering her own child? And essentially, especially if there's this belief that there's an afterlife and there's heaven or whatever is better than being left enslaved. As many people agree with Killmonger's line in Black Panther, that he would jump off the slave ship rather than be enslaved. These women were taking on a similar train of thought in ending the life of their offspring, but then also the strength in the women who fought for their offspring to survive, even though that meant that for generations after them, their family line would still be enslaved. And there's a lot of parallels to this experience of Black women during slavery to what is now happening to June in Handmaid's Tale without any notation or acknowledgement or conversation around race. So I was kind of okay with watching a show that didn't necessarily comment on race because it was such a captivating show the first season, and they said that they would handle race in the second season. And in the original novel, the Black community, mind you, Margaret Atwood I believe is Canadian, the Black community is banished as the children of Ham, which isn't Ham whose son? Japheth, Canaan. Yeah, I would say, isn't Ham one of Noah's sons, the brother of Canaan? But they were banished as the children of Ham, and they were banished to another land, and that's kind of how she dealt with race. I think we've come far enough in the past 34 years to have a better understanding, and both a better understanding, a better knowledge base, a better historical context to better create a story narrative that acknowledges both the history of Black people in America and how far we've come, but how little we've come, and how much of our trauma still mirrors the trauma that has been happening to us for generations and what's been going on in the 21st century. The show pretty much said that they were post-race and essentially inserted Black characters. So the main character, the protagonist of the show, is June, who has been kidnapped into becoming a handmaid. She tried to escape with her husband, who is the actor who plays him is actually biracial. In the show, I think he's quote unquote a Black man. And actually, the backstory on June is that her husband was a Black man married to a Black woman and started cheating on his Black wife with June and left his Black wife for June. June and Luke have a child who is therefore Black. When they get caught trying to escape, and a lot of the show is set in Boston, so they get caught trying to cross the Massachusetts border? Canada? They're trying to cross over into Canada, and so many parallels to slavery. June and her daughter get caught, and her husband's able to escape, and June's punishment, because somehow they have record of the fact that she was essentially an adulteress, because she was married to a man who was a divorcee. That is adultery when you go and marry another partner, because your divorce is not legitimized in biblical senses. And that's why June is punished as a handmaid, and handmaids are referred to as the name of the man whose house they are in. So she's originally in the house of the Waterfords, and the husband's name is Joseph. So she's no longer June, she becomes of Joseph. There are Black characters aside from Luke. There's also Samira Wiley, largely known from Orange is the New Black. She plays Mora, who was a close friend of June's. Mora originally becomes a handmaid and then is sent to be a Jezebel, and finds her escape and ends up killing a commander in the process, which is what the white men in power are called. And she escapes to Canada and finds Luke, and they now reside together. Then there are Black couples in the ruling class in Gilead. And I think though that I was okay with the show the first season, I didn't disagree with the criticisms, I just decided not to lean into it. And I did feel like at the point of first season that the show technically did have a responsibility to talk about race, but also the fact that the evangelical Christian movement, a lot of the theology, a lot of the outward cultural theology of the evangelical Christian movement has been held on to about how to oppress the Black body. You know, originally the evangelical Christian movement, which came out of the Southern Baptist movement, was originally about their belief in the right to own slaves. And it's actually, you know, Margaret Atwood in the book saying that African Americans get abolished as the children of Ham is a parallel to how the evangelical Christian, well, the precursor to the evangelical Christian movement, the Christianity of slavery, used the scriptures around Ham, Noah's son, to justify their right to hold slaves. A good chunk of evangelical Christian movement and Southern Baptist movement and that moral majority type Christianity has largely relied on initially fighting for the right to own slaves, then fighting for the right to segregate, and then when the Civil Rights Act of '64 passed, they moved over to abortion. And so a lot of these cultural wars are coded, are veiled, are ways in which they can still fight a cultural war that fights for this sort of belief in white purity and maligns black and brown bodies. And so to use evangelical Christianity as the precipice for this violent dystopian conservative society, but not at all acknowledge, discuss, put into the narrative their racial history is disingenuous. For me, it has now become a problem because we are now watching black bodies being used as a sort of trauma porn without at all building up their story or character arc. Now, I think there's definitely very fair criticism about the flatness of Maura, Samara Wiley's character, compared to the sort of robustness we got with Emily. Now, Emily is a handmaid who was of Glenn, and I actually think the treatment and the character arc of Emily as a whole parallels the lack of care given to quite a few of the black characters that we have seen, especially with season 3, right? Because in season 2, Emily, we get her entire backstory as a well-educated doctor who was in a lesbian relationship. They had a son together. Her wife, I believe, was an immigrant or had a passport or access to another country. And so it was easy for her to get out, and they got to the airport, tried to get out, and they couldn't. And you know, it was really good commentary on how easy it is for us to like, how close we are to this reality. You know, the show really does hit that note very well. And then Emily's kind of torture through Gilead and as a handmaid, getting her clit cut off and then being sent to the colonies, somehow surviving and having no after effects or health issues with having to dig up radioactive dirt, and essentially killing a woman, or because a wife ends up at the colonies, which is a punishment camp. Emily helps to kill her, essentially. And then when she is sent back to Gilead because there was a short of a Handmaid's Tale because there was a revolt and there was a bombing, which there was no further, like we have this big bombing that happens in season 2, right? That was really a great scene, and it would have been like nothing went with that, you know, like somehow Gilead just becomes more insular and they bring back handmaids from the colonies, and like there's no real other acknowledgement or discussion of the resistance. But we're not gonna get into a flat criticism of the show. I really wanna focus more on the racial tension in the show, the lack of racial acknowledgement in the show. But Emily comes back to Gilead and ends up beating the shit out of Aunt Lydia to a pulp in the house of Lawrence, Commander Lawrence, and doesn't end up dead. She's still allowed to live. The resistance helps her to escape along with June. June makes the epic privileged white woman decision at the end of season 2 to hand the baby that she's had over to Emily to escape to Canada and turn back around and put into harm's way all the Marthas and all the people of the resistance who were undercover trying to help her escape, and pop back up into Gilead, the dumb bitch, but whatever, you know what I mean? If we gotta move the storyline along, we gotta move the storyline along, so I guess. But June, I was already realizing in the first and second season how much the show relied on the privilege, the white fragility and white women privilege of June, because in the second season, that couple that I was talking about, the interracial couple, who she ends up getting the husband, well, they do hanging, so the husband essentially lynched. That's another thing, that the way that Gilead chooses to punish people and to kill them is essentially to lynch them and publicly hang their bodies. And you have all these nods to not only slavery, but the Jim Crow era, to the racial terrorism that black people faced in America for hundreds of years, and that was at its height in the 1920s and 30s, and not at all address that somehow this same group that is known as part of the, you know, all those white people you see in them pictures of sitting at luncheons and screaming at black children trying to desegregate schools, a lot of them ended up being the evangelical Christians. There is no discussion, there is no acknowledgement, there is no care given to that at all, and a lot of the imagery and trauma that is shown in the show just so much parallels the trauma that black Americans have faced in this country. Still, to go back to Emily, some of the best episodes of season 2 revolved around Emily's character. There was a lot of care taken, there was a lot of nuance and character arc and backstory given to Emily. And Maura, who I think is just as interesting, if not more interesting than Emily, doesn't really get the same sort of care to her story arc. Who gets even less care to their story arc is the black handmaid that is introduced in season 3 as June's walking partner, of Matthew. What's really sparking this entire, when I sit down and even do this review, I was really offended with how her story ends in episode 8 of this season. There's gonna be spoilers, but ain't no way to talk about it without talking about it. June at this point has done so many things blatantly wrong that if we are going to follow the rules set in the show of how Gilead functions, June should have been dead. Should have been hanged, should have been burned, should have been had locks put around her feet and thrown into the pool and let drown. Whatever the weird ass ways that they kill people, June should have been gone. And I think the show is definitely aware of the fact that June is allowed to live and survive after all we've seen her go through is just absolutely absurd and fantastical. Because in the scene with the aunts going over where to place certain handmaids, you know, Aunt Lydia, who is the head aunt, one of the main supporting characters in the show, makes a comment about how June has to survive for reasons. It's like an on-the-nose nod to the absurdness that the show is going in. For June to be allowed to do all these wild things and her livelihood maintained, for Emily to literally pummel Aunt Lydia, and the way they get her out the house, the way she is a way to maneuver, the way her storyline goes, and there is literally there is a mental trauma, there's a psychological trauma that she's left with, but the physical harm to her body, and the clip thing is huge. I'm not undermining that at all, but she can still breathe, she still walk, she's able to make it to Canada and progress, and there's all these build up, there's all this nuance. Even with Janine is batshit crazy, right? But Janine, her character arc has been moved so far along that there's a lot of compassion for Janine. I actually don't think Janine is simply, I don't think it's actually fair for me to say flatly that Janine is crazy, right? Janine has some issues that she is working through, but I think her character has a lot of depth and nuance. And we just don't at all get an ounce of that with this black character of Matthew. First of all, the actress playing her, I believe it's, what's her name? The actress's name is Ashley Lathrop, I want to say. She is gorgeous. The girl who's playing of Matthew is a gorgeous girl. But essentially her character came in, and this is not the first person of color character we have seen who on the show who sort of blindly feeds into the dogma and their role of oppression in Gilead, right? There was, I believe, a Martha who was like, I was a prostitute and a crackhead before this, and so this is great because I get a bed and a place to sleep. And of Matthew is like, I'm on my 4th pregnancy and I'm happy to be having babies, right? She's like super fertile, okay? The black girl is super fertile, and she's just sort of blindly following it. She's just kind of doopy, well, Lydia told me to report on you. Lydia told me to keep my eye on you. And then how we have Lydia so easily fall for the setups that June puts of Matthew in, right? We get no sort of backstory. We never even hear her real name. She just flatly is a Handmaid's Tale who's kind of okay with the violence and the abuse that she's enduring in Gilead, and actually sees it as her Christian duty. And that irritates the hell out of June. But June been getting black people killed all 3 seasons of Handmaid's Tale, and the fact that of Matthew's sort of dramatic pivot to a mad woman who pulls a gun out of a guardian's belt and points it without having the chance to shoot it. And mind you, she's pregnant with the commander's child. And in Gilead, they are supposed to want to protect pregnant women at all costs, because when June goes off the handle, when June does some batshit crazy stuff, but she is pregnant, they basically lock her up in a gymnasium and ensure that she gives birth to this baby because they know that she is trying to kill herself. But the black woman just gets shot on sight, and then her body is dragged through the grocery store and this really bloody scene. And I just feel like this was such careless handling. The episode before that, so June's daughter Hannah is in a house, in a commander house. June's trying to rescue her child from Gilead, but at this point she's really just trying to see her child. And some of her handmaids in whatever that I don't know if they in the resistance, I don't know if they just buddy with her, set it up so that she could talk to the Martha who's in the house where her daughter Hannah resides. I think her daughter's name is now called Agnes in Gilead. And so this black Martha begrudgingly talks to June in the grocery store and Of Matthew sees it. And all we get is a glimpse of Matthew seeing them talk. Martha saying, look, this is where the child goes to school, ask for this guardian so you can get in, to both the guardian disappearing and then the Martha being hung. And it's just so sort of implausible, right? That June gets no punishment for her breach, and that this black woman who we know nothing more of than of the Martha who lives in the house with Agnes, but somehow this Martha has had several interactions with June and seems to be taking very good care of this black child, but we just don't get any sort of, there's nothing to her character, and she's simply hung. We hung in episode 7, to now seeing Of Matthew being sort of bloodily murdered when every other, I mean, Janine tried to jump off a bridge with a baby. I think the idea that a handmaid who is so pious can snap is plausible, but there's all these other buildup and reactions that, one, keep them alive, but that makes sense for the point in which they break and how they break. And that Of Matthew initially points the gun at June and doesn't shoot her, because trust you me, I don't even believe in violence like this, but June should have got shot. And then points it at Lydia, and like, you know, I know they do that 3 seconds, so like in reality this is a really quick movement, but then she doesn't like quickly pull the trigger, and it's just shot. She's visibly pregnant, and it's just shot by a guardian and then drug out, and that's the end of it. And in the era of Black Lives Matter, and the era where we're having this discussion about watching state violence against black bodies, and this sort of trauma porn that has become everyday occurrences on the internet, and the ethical issues with this and how we need to view the consumption of the state violence against black bodies, to have this character so carelessly murdered, so carelessly handled through season 3 is just so offensive to how much the show parallels the violence experienced by black women while keeping these white women very cozy, very kept, and very privileged, and never addressing not only the history of America in this racial terrorism, but the specific group of people who are now again find themselves in power in the 21st century. I just feel like Handmaid's Tale has taken it too far and is doing too much, and it's a problem. And I just don't even know where to go from here with it. I'm just so disgusted. None of what's being suggested are crazy ask of the show, right? Particularly with this show, because they do get so much about evangelical Christianity and the dogma and the way people feed into the beliefs, while also making life more difficult for themselves, particularly with the character of Serena, who I do think Serena is like so well done, both in the acting. Yvonne, I don't know her last name, killing Serena. I think Serena's character arc is phenomenal, but they just dropped the ball so much and then unnecessarily add this level of trauma, and it's like a smack in the face. It's so little to do that would change so much of the show. But June is annoying. June, I can't root for June. I mean, I low-key stopped rooting for June after she was up in that house where she was reading them newspapers. You know, the first time June tried to escape and then foiled it, I could not, was over it. And it's just, she makes a lot of selfish decisions that get people killed, that are, and I mean, I think Janine telling her that she only thinks about herself is a very true statement, because she's essentially also making it harder for the resistance to combat Gilead at all. It's about 7 more episodes of this season, and oh girl, this is a significant problem. So if you've been watching the show, let me know your thought. Where do we go from here? I'm gonna take a break from watching and maybe skim through the end of the season. This is bad and I'm pissed, and that's it. But if you watch the show, let me know in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for just tuning into my thoughts, and I'll holla at y'all later. Deuces!